There is a phrase that gets used as a kind of consolation prize, a pat on the head disguised as encouragement. They're just a late bloomer. It sounds generous, it sounds patient, but underneath it is a very specific assumption that there is a correct timeline for human development, and that you have failed to meet it. Society operates on an implicit schedule. Graduate by 22, establish a life path by 25, find a partner, buy a home, hit your stride by 30. And if you haven't checked those boxes in that order, in that window, you are behind. You are delayed. You are the late bloomer, which is really just a polite way of saying you are the person who couldn't keep up. But here is what's clinically interesting about that framing. It is almost entirely wrong. The late bloomer is not a person who failed to develop on time. The late bloomer is a person whose developmental energy was allocated somewhere else entirely, somewhere that wasn't visible, somewhere that didn't photograph well, somewhere that didn't translate into a LinkedIn update or a wedding announcement. And what was happening in that invisible space was often far more foundational than anything their peers were building on the surface. This is not inspiration. This is not a motivational reframe. This is what the research actually shows when you stop measuring people against industrial age benchmarks and start examining how complex cognition, identity formation, and psychological resilience actually develop in practice. Let's talk about what's really going on with the person the world calls late. Think about what it actually feels like, not the theory, the daily experience. You're 31, maybe 34, maybe 27, and it's already started. You open your phone in the morning, and before your feet hit the floor, you've already seen it. Someone from high school just closed on a house. Someone you graduated with just got promoted to director. There's an engagement ring, a baby announcement, a friend launching their second business. And you're lying there, in an apartment you're not sure you can afford next month, in a job you fell into sideways, wondering why the thing that seems to come so naturally to everyone else feels like trying to read a language you were never taught. You go to work. You're competent, perhaps even talented. But there's a gap between what you're doing and what you know you're capable of, and you can feel it every single day, like a low hum you can't turn off. You sit in meetings with people who seem to have a certainty you don't have, not intelligence, certainty. They chose a direction at 22 and they just walked. And you're still standing at the fork in the path, holding the map, turning it over, because none of the routes feel quite right, and you refuse, on some level you can't fully articulate, to walk a path that isn't yours. Then the evening comes. And this is where it really happens. This is the part nobody sees. You read. You think. You go down research spirals at midnight that have nothing to do with your job. You sit with questions that most people stopped asking in college. You journal. Or you don't journal. You just replay conversations in your head, deconstructing them, looking for what was actually being said underneath the words. You notice patterns in people that they don't notice in themselves. You sense shifts in rooms that nobody else registers. And then you feel guilty about it. Because none of this rich, obsessive, relentless inner processing produces anything that looks like progress to the outside world. You go to a family gathering and someone asks what you've been up to, and you can feel the weight of the question, because the honest answer is, I've been becoming someone. But that's not an answer anyone accepts. So you give the shorthand, still figuring things out, and you watch their face do that thing, that micro-expression of concern mixed with something less generous, and you absorb it. You file it away with all the other moments where you understood clearly that the world has a very specific definition of progress, and you are not meeting it. You've started things. You've started many things. Some of them were brilliant and you walked away anyway, not because you failed, but because you could feel they weren't right. And that distinction, the difference between quitting because something is hard and leaving because something is misaligned, is a distinction the outside world is almost completely unequipped to recognize. So you tell yourself you're behind. You're not behind. You're doing something else entirely. And that something else has a name. In developmental psychology, there is a distinction between what's called horizontal development and vertical development. Horizontal development is the acquisition of skills, knowledge, and credentials. It's what most of the visible milestones measure. You got the degree. You got the job. You learned the software. Horizontal development is additive. You are gaining things and stacking them. Vertical development is different. Vertical development is a shift in how you make meaning. It's not about what you know. It's about the complexity of the framework you use to interpret what you know. It changes how you see, not what you see. And here is the critical point. Vertical development cannot be rushed. It cannot be forced by external pressure. And it almost always looks like stagnation from the outside, because the person undergoing it is not producing visible output. They are reorganizing their entire operating system. Robert Kegan's work on adult development at Harvard described this process in stages. Most adults, he found, operated what he called the socialized mind, a stage where identity and decision-making are largely shaped by external expectations. The roles you're supposed to play, the timeline you're supposed to follow, the definition of success you inherited from your environment. The next stage, the self-authoring mind, is where a person develops an internal authority. They begin generating their own framework for meaning rather than borrowing one from the culture around them. They stop asking, "What am I supposed to do?" and start asking, "What is actually true for me?" This transition is not automatic. Many adults never make it, and those who do often go through a period that looks, from the outside, like they are lost, like they are falling behind, like they are failing to launch. They are not failing to launch. They are in the middle of a cognitive restructuring that their peers, the ones who moved faster, who committed earlier, who checked the boxes, may never undergo at all. There is a reason this matters beyond personal development. The self-authoring mind is where original thinking begins. It is where a person stops reproducing the ideas of their environment and starts generating ideas from an internal framework. Every significant creative contribution, every paradigm-shifting business, every work of art that actually changes something, comes from a mind that has undergone this transition. You cannot produce original output from a borrowed operating system. And the late bloomer is, often without realizing it, in the process of building an original one from scratch. This explains something that you've probably noticed but couldn't name. The late bloomer has an unusual tolerance for ambiguity. They can sit with not knowing in a way that makes other people deeply uncomfortable. And this isn't a passive trait. This is a developed capacity, a direct result of having spent years in an unresolved space without collapsing into a premature answer just to relieve the tension. In psychology, this is called negative capability, a term borrowed from the poet John Keats, but adopted in clinical and organizational literature to describe the ability to remain in uncertainty without reaching for false resolution. It is one of the rarest and most valuable cognitive capacities a person can develop, and the late bloomer has been training it, involuntarily, painfully, for years. There is more happening neurologically than just tolerance, though. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for long-term planning, consequence evaluation, impulse regulation, and complex decision-making, does not fully mature until the mid to late 20s. In some individuals, this maturation extends into the early 30s. This is not a disorder. This is not a deficit. This is biological variance in the timeline of the most sophisticated cognitive hardware a human being possesses. What this means in practice is that a person who delays major life decisions into their late 20s or early 30s, maybe, without knowing it, waiting for the neurological infrastructure that would allow them to make those decisions well. Their hesitation is not dysfunction. It is a form of implicit self-regulation. The brain protecting itself from commitments it is not yet equipped to evaluate at full capacity. Compare this to the person who committed early. They chose a vocation at 22 with an incomplete prefrontal cortex. They chose a partner, a city, a lifestyle, all with the confidence that comes from not yet having the cognitive complexity to see the full range of alternatives. This is not a criticism. It is simply a description of how early commitment works. It narrows the field before the field has been fully perceived. The late bloomer perceived the field. That's what took so long. Now let's place these two people side by side, the early committer and the late bloomer, and observe how they process the same situation. Take a career setback, a layoff, a failed project, a business that didn't work. The early committer, the person who built their identity on a linear path, often experiences this as a threat to self-coherence. Their story was, I chose correctly, I executed well, and therefore I am successful. When that narrative breaks, they are left without a framework. The setback doesn't just cost them a job, it costs them an identity. This is what psychologists call an identity foreclosure crisis, a collapse of meaning that occurs when a prematurely adopted identity is disrupted by reality. The late bloomer processes the same event differently, not because they are tougher, not because they don't feel it, but because their identity was never built on that single narrative in the first place. They have already lived through ambiguity. They have already survived not having a clear story to tell at dinner parties. Their sense of self was forged in the absence of external validation, which means it is not dependent on external validation to remain intact. This is a structural difference in psychological architecture, not a difference in character or willpower. The late bloomer built a distributed identity, one that draws from multiple sources of meaning rather than a single career or relationship narrative. And distributed systems, in any engineering context, are more resilient to single points of failure. Now look at relationships. The early committer chose a partner when they were still, in many cases, operating from the socialized mind, choosing based on what felt expected, what looked right, what matched the cultural template. The late bloomer, arriving at partnership later, often does so from the self-authoring mind. They have spent years refining their understanding of what they actually need, not what they were told to want. The result is not a guarantee of success, but a relationship built on a more examined foundation. And this creates a friction the late bloomer knows well. The external world sees a 35-year-old who finally found a partner and reads it as delay. The internal reality is a person who refused to commit to the wrong thing and waited, at significant social cost, until they could commit to the right one. This gap between internal reality and external perception is the central wound of the late bloomer's experience. They are constantly being measured by a clock that has nothing to do with the process they are actually undergoing. It is like being judged for the speed of your construction by people who cannot see the building. The social pressure this creates is not trivial. Research on temporal comparison, the psychological process of measuring your own progress against age-normed expectations, shows that perceived timeline deviation is one of the most potent triggers of shame and self-doubt in adults. Not failure, not incompetence, simply being off schedule. The late bloomer lives inside this pressure every day. And the fact that they continue to develop, continue to deepen, continue to resist premature closure while absorbing that pressure is itself a form of psychological endurance that most personality assessments are not even designed to measure. There is another contrast worth examining: how each group handles the question of purpose. The early committer often discovers purpose retroactively. They chose a path, committed to it, and then constructed meaning around that choice after the fact. This is not dishonest. It is a normal cognitive process called post hoc rationalization. You act first, then you build the story of why. And for many people, that story holds. It works. It provides enough meaning to sustain a career and a life. The late bloomer tends to work in the opposite direction. They need the meaning first. They need to understand why before they move. And because genuine purpose, not borrowed purpose, not inherited purpose, but self-generated purpose, takes time to crystallize, they wait. They circle. They test and discard. They look indecisive, but what they are actually doing is refusing to build on a foundation they haven't inspected. This is an expensive process. It costs years. It costs social standing. It costs the comfort of having a simple answer when someone asks what you do. But the structure it eventually produces is qualitatively different from one built on post hoc rationalization. It is a structure built on examined premises. And examined premises do not collapse under scrutiny the way inherited ones do. So what does the late bloomer actually possess when the pieces finally come together? First, and this is the most consistently observed trait in the research, they possess an unusual depth of self-knowledge. Not the performative self-awareness that comes from reading a personality quiz. The kind that comes from having spent years in forced confrontation with the question of who they actually are, absent the scaffolding of a ready-made identity. They have mapped their own psychology, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. The path wasn't given, so they had to build it from the internal architecture outward. Second, they possess cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between frameworks, tolerate contradiction, and integrate competing perspectives. This is a direct product of having lived in ambiguity for extended periods. The brain adapts to the demands placed on it. A person who has spent years navigating uncertainty develops a neural comfort with complexity that someone on a linear path, someone who was always certain of the next step, simply did not have the opportunity to develop. Third, and this is the one that tends to surprise people, they possess a relationship to intrinsic motivation that is qualitatively different from their peers. The early committer was often propelled by external structure, the next grade, the next promotion, the next milestone. The late bloomer, having fallen outside that structure, was forced to develop a self-generated engine. When they finally move, they move because something internal has aligned. And internally generated motivation is, in every study that has examined it, more durable, more adaptive, and more resistant to burnout than its extrinsic counterpart. Fourth, they carry a specific and hard-won form of emotional regulation. Years of absorbing social comparison, years of sitting with the discomfort of being behind, years of managing the cognitive dissonance between internal knowing and external judgment. This is not passive suffering. This is training. The late bloomer has been performing emotional heavy lifting that most people are never required to do, because most people had the structure of a conventional timeline to stabilize them. The late bloomer stabilized themselves. And a person who can stabilize themselves does not collapse when external circumstances shift. And fifth, they possess patience that is not passivity. This is the distinction the outside world almost always gets wrong. The late bloomer's patience is not the result of low ambition or low energy. It is a disciplined refusal to act before understanding has matured. It is the same instinct that keeps a surgeon in residency for an extra year or a writer working on a novel for a decade. The product is better because the process was not hurried. And the late bloomer has internalized this principle not as a philosophy, but as a lived practice. Here is the clinical summary, stated without sentiment. The late bloomer is not a person who was slow. The late bloomer is a person whose development prioritized depth over speed, integration over accumulation, and self-authorship over social compliance. The timeline they were measured against was never designed for what they were building, and what they were building, a self that is flexible, self-aware, internally motivated, and structurally resilient, is not visible on any standard metric of success until it is. And when it becomes visible, the people around them will call it sudden. They'll say it came out of nowhere. They'll say they always knew you had it in you, which is its own kind of irony, given that they spent years implying you didn't. But you will know the truth. It wasn't sudden. It was never sudden. It was always happening, in the place no one thought to look. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more Uncanny Psychology. What part of this video resonated most with you? What video would you like for us to make next? Let us know in the comments.